Russia is preparing to use nuclear weapons if America gives Ukraine the green light to use its most devastating weapons deep inside Russian territory. Or at least that's what Russia wants you to believe. With Ukraine liberating a lot of Russia's Kursk Oblast from Russia and the battle in the east of Ukraine heating up, Kyiv has begun to request free use of America's most powerful weapons inside Russia itself. And Russia is terrified of this happening. On August 27th, the Kremlin made the announcement that it was clarifying the wording of its doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons, allegedly to give more, quote, clarity. This announcement came as Ukraine seems to have reached the limit of exploitation in its invasion of the Kursk Oblast, launched new incursions into Belgorod, and has been pressuring international allies to give it the green light to strike at military targets deep inside Russia. While Putin was more than happy to allow Ukraine to kill Russian conscripts en masse and seize territory inhabited by mostly lower-class Russians, it's the thought of American weapons striking deep into Russia that spurred him into action. The specific weapons in mind are ATACMS and other Western-supplied missiles such as Storm Shadow and potentially an unannounced American long-range strike missile. For 2 years, Kyiv lobbied for these critical weapons in order to defend itself from Russian aggression, and it only started receiving them in April. These proved highly effective against Russian formations and facilities inside of Ukraine. ATACMS famously made its debut by destroying a large number of Russian attack helicopters in one strike, driving the Ka-52 attack helicopter further down the endangered species list. But Ukraine has had one major problem, which Russia has happily exploited. The Ukrainian military is fighting with one arm tied behind its back. Unable to strike across its border into Russia with Western weapons, time and again Russia has exploited the West's fear of escalation to stage troops and equipment from the safety of its border regions with Ukraine. Combat aircraft frequently launched sorties from right outside Ukrainian territory, and supply convoys were free to gather before crossing the border and dispersing. Ukraine needed to break Russia's ability to exploit the border as it pleased, and it took a near catastrophe to gain permission to start doing that. In May, Russia launched its predicted summer offensive, with a massive troop concentration of between 30,000 to 50,000 personnel ready to assault the city of Kharkiv. They made easy initial gains, with Ukraine putting up little resistance near the border regions. The city was in serious danger of falling, a crippling tactical and morale loss which might have swung the tide of the war irrevocably in Russia's favor. The key to stopping the assault was striking Russians in their staging areas, right across the border, where men, equipment and supplies were being gathered with no fear of retaliation, Russia counting on Western self-deterrence to protect them. In a move that surprised the world, President Biden secretly gave the green light for use of American weapons in the border regions, expanding their use to any area near the Russian-Ukrainian border being used to mass troops or stage equipment. This has hard limits, and Ukraine couldn't strike deep into the Russian rear as it needed in order to win the war, but it was a start. In one blistering barrage, hundreds of GMLRS rockets smashed into Russian formations. ATACMS missiles did the job they were originally designed to do: deliver 472 pounds, 214 kilograms of high explosive democracy right on top of Russian heads, inside Russian territory. Total casualties remain a tightly guarded secret, but what is known is the Kharkiv assault faltered due to the lifting of firing restrictions across the Russian border. Later, when Ukraine launched a special military operation into Kursk, this army grouping was originally believed to be the force Russia would use to counter the Ukrainian invasion. The fact that it didn't strongly signals that casualties from the fighting on the border were extensive. It's becoming increasingly clear that among the many objectives of the Kursk invasion, chief amongst them was to break the taboo of Russian nuclear threats. Since the beginning of this conflict, Vladimir Putin has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons as a way to deter the West from providing support to Kyiv, and it's worked wondrously. For over 2 years now, Western leaders have carefully deliberated each and every bullet sent to Ukraine, weighing its military value versus the risk of making Putin mad and him lobbing a nuke at someone. Heavy restrictions were placed on Ukraine's use of Western arms, and physical limits were even made via modifications to some weapons to keep Ukraine from firing them deep into Russia. Meanwhile, Russia was, and continues to be, free to use North Korean and Iranian ballistic missiles and drones anywhere in Ukraine that it wants to. The irony of Russia being able to strike anywhere it wants with its allies' weapons, but Ukraine not being able to do the same with its allies' weapons, isn't lost on an increasingly embittered President Zelensky. Yet Western media faithfully amplified the Kremlin's nuclear threats at each and every opportunity, doing the job of deterrence for them. Even now, with the ultimate taboo broken, the West continues to debate if Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons inside of Russia, taking out supply depots and airfields deep behind the front lines that it needs to if it's actually going to win the war. Right on cue, Russian President Vladimir Putin once again rattled the nuclear saber, with announcements via Russia's foreign minister and Slavic Uncle Lurch, Sergei Lavrov, that Russia would be clarifying the wording on its nuclear doctrine. Unless that clarification is, we won't use nuclear weapons because we know the West has better ones, and theirs probably all work because Private Conscriptovich didn't steal all the copper wiring out of them, then this is once again another bit of fear-mongering. Or is it? Could Russia actually be ready to use nuclear weapons, and why hasn't it yet? Even before the war in Ukraine, Russian nuclear doctrine was clear. It would use nuclear weapons in defense of the homeland, or if the existence of the Russian state itself was at risk. This is very unambiguous, and part of why the West has taken over 2 years and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian casualties to warm up to the idea of allowing strikes into Russian territory. With the invasion of Kursk, though, many are wondering where the Russian nuclear response is, or if it might come at all. After the stunning success of the fall 2022 counterattack by Ukrainian forces, many feared that Putin was being driven to the use of nuclear weapons out of desperation and to avoid embarrassment. The 3-day special military operation was over 6 months old at this point, and Russian casualties were extreme. The massive convoy to Kyiv had been a military embarrassment the likes of which history books haven't seen since possibly the Second World War, and to add to the sting, the introduction of just 24 American HIMARS to the war resulted in disproportionate losses on the Russian side. Poor training and even worse doctrine has led the Russians to centralize their supplies, making them easy targets for Ukrainian HIMARS strikes all across the front, and creating one hell of a fireworks display. Command posts were likewise poorly disguised and created close to the front lines, until dozens of senior Russian officers were permanently retired during GMLR's bombardments. As France's President Emmanuel Macron had famously said, Putin must not be humiliated, but humiliated he had been. The world braced for the worst. Unable to cope with even a tiny number of advanced NATO weapon systems, it was widely feared that Putin would reach out in desperation for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. These strikes would have little military value given how low the yield and how widely dispersed Ukrainian forces were. Russia would have to lob dozens of them to achieve any significant battlefield effect. Plus, all of that fallout would just flow to Russia on prevailing winds. A few nuclear detonations on the front lines would have been the end of all Western support for Ukraine. Except America's President Biden had something to say about that, something that scared Putin enough to disregard the idea altogether. It remains unknown exactly what was exchanged between the two sides, but it is known that an American military delegation spearheaded by the Secretary of Defense met with their Russian counterparts, with Secretary Lloyd Austin laying out the exact response from the United States if Russia dropped a single nuke. While the specifics remain unclear, it's now believed that President Biden has warned that the first instance of a nuclear weapon being used would result in the US military carrying out a conventional strike to destroy the unit responsible for launching the attack. The second use of a nuclear weapon would prompt an American military strike against Russian forces in Ukraine. At the time, it was believed that this would have been the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet. A third strike would prompt a wider conventional campaign against all Russian forces currently engaged inside of Ukraine. The details remain secret and likely will for many years to come until this war is well and truly over, but President Biden had made it clear to President Putin, if you launch a single nuclear weapon, the Russian Federation's military would face the full might of American military power. Washington's warning to the Kremlin was backed up by strong signaling from Beijing deterring Russia from the use of nuclear weapons. President Xi remains a silent ally to Russia, providing untold amounts of low-level but still critical military aid to the Russian military, such as vehicles, body armor, and ammunition. Xi needs Russia to win in Ukraine because a successful Russia ties up NATO military power in Europe and prevents it from deterring his own plans to annex Taiwan by force and intimidate China's regional neighbors into concessions of valuable maritime claims. But Russia using nukes is a hard red line for China. Even India, which has been happily buying up cheap Russian gas, has warned Putin away from the use of nuclear weapons. Neither nation wants to be tied down even more than they already are to a global pariah state, significantly harming their own foreign relations and global standing. But will Putin actually listen when there's signals that growing desperation is driving him towards the nuclear option? Many were surprised when nukes didn't fly over the Kursk invasion, yet this would have made little sense as Ukrainian forces were widely dispersed and Russia would just be nuking itself. Likewise, a nuclear attack into Ukraine would have made little sense unless a large number of weapons were used, or one with a very high yield, likely against a target like a city, in order to intimidate Ukraine in the West. For over 2 years, the thought of a Ukrainian military incursion into Russia spurred thoughts of nuclear Armageddon from across the West, let alone an invasion spearheaded with Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Given everything that Putin has to lose if he does resort to nukes though, unleashing them over a Kursk invasion simply doesn't make any sense. The territories liberated by Ukraine are largely strategically meaningless except to serve as a buffer zone, with little economic value and filled with Putin's least favorite Russians, poor ones. Well, that's kind of a misnomer because poor Russians are actually Putin's favorite type of Russians. It's poor Russians who he can't recruit to fight in Ukraine that Putin doesn't care about. The Kursk invasion doesn't even threaten any supply routes or disrupt any logistical or military bases supporting Russian operations inside Ukraine. Aside from the embarrassment of being invaded more successfully by the people you are trying to invade, the Kursk operation has little overall direct military value, certainly not worth using nukes over. To clarify a point though, the Kursk invasion has been a massive success with very real strategic value, spurring new aid packages from Ukraine's allies, breaking the taboo of Western weapons being used inside Russia, and forcing the Kremlin to figure out how to protect its border and limit further invasion with a military already stretched too thin for major combat operations inside Ukraine itself. The Kursk invasion has been a strategic coup. It's just that the part of Russia it captured poses little military cost on the Kremlin and can't be compared to the seizure of valuable military targets such as bases and airfields. What might be worth using nuclear weapons over though, at least in Putin's mind, is reinforcing the now broken taboo of Western arms being utilized inside Russia. If there's one thing that scares Putin, it's the thought of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles raining down on valuable military targets deep inside Russia. Given the difficulty in stopping Ukraine's drone campaign against extremely valuable economic targets throughout Russia, such as oil fields and processing plants, the Russian military is in no position to try to also defend its military assets against long-range attacks. These sorts of attacks could have a very real impact on the war. While Ukrainian drones have caused damage to Russian aircraft, a volley of ATACMS packing thousands of pounds of good old-fashioned American high explosive could significantly degrade Russia's fleet of strategic aircraft. What aircraft survive would be forced to launch operations from even further away to keep them out of the reach of Western weapons. This would directly translate to a massive slowdown in Russian air operations, giving the Ukrainians badly needed breathing room. In July, Ukrainian forces in some parts of the front were experiencing as many as 50 glide bomb attacks a day. Russian fighter aircraft would face the same damage and risk, pushing them further away from the fighting as well. This would open up a big hole in the sky for Ukrainian strike and fighter aircraft, leveling the playing field significantly and creating a big opportunity for Ukraine's newest piece of Western kit, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. These aircraft, despite being older models, are still a massive leap ahead in capabilities for the Ukrainians and pose a significant threat to even Russian fighters. With the skies contested, Ukraine could use these aircraft to launch sophisticated Western munitions that are more than capable than what its Soviet-era aircraft can carry, with great battlefield effect. A ground offensive by Ukraine is also back on the cards. In 2023, Ukraine's summer offensive stymied by vast defensive fortifications, minefields, and Russia's air power. Take away Russian air power though, and Ukrainian tanks and IFVs can operate with much more freedom, while Ukrainian aircraft can provide the frontline support that Russian forces have been enjoying for most of this war. And this is why Putin is once again rattling the nuclear saber, because losing the air advantage from strikes on airfields and the significant damage that could be inflicted on Russian ground equipment and logistics could end up with him losing the war. Even worse, massive strikes deep inside Russia would bring the war home to the average Russian in a way that the small-scale drone campaign, even if very successful, simply can't. This threatens to further sway support from a population that is already reaching high levels of war weariness and disillusionment in Putin's promises. But will Putin cross this hard red line? Almost certainly not. If Putin truly intended to use nuclear weapons, then he would simply do so. The latest announcement by Sergei Lavrov that Russia's nuclear doctrine was being clarified is simply another attempt to scare the West. Russia is very much the boy who cried nuke, another example of, no guys, this time, I'm for real, and the type of behavior you'd expect from a schoolyard bully backed up into a corner. It's not just an embarrassing display, it's a signal of just how weak Russia is and how much it fears Western military power. Now go and check out how Ukraine's invasion turned Russian civilians against Putin, or click this other video instead.